Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Farmer. I'm the festival director of Out on Film Atlanta's LGBTQ Film Festival. I'm also an arts reporter for Georgia Voice. I'm very happy today to be talking to the director of the documentary Lover of Men, The Untold History of Abraham Lincoln, directed by Shaun Peterson. It's now available on streaming. This is such a fascinating documentary. Thank you, Shaun, for talking to us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
And congratulations on the film.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's been, oh, holy cow. Do you hear back behind me? Can you hear that? There's like literally the electric company is like chopping a
I
tree
I,
down right now.
I personally don't hear it.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. Okay. Great. These filters are great. Well, thank you so much for, having me. And, yeah, the film it's been a wild ride. We knew that this would be a charged topic and that people would respond to it. But, we've been getting so much press. And, what I enjoy doing interviews like this because I want to get, some of the finer points of the film out there because
Yeah.
you see a lot of headlines that are like, was Abraham Lincoln gay? And we go to great lengths to talk about the history of the binaries, the history of what it is to have sexual identity, which is a very, very new concept.
Yeah.
And so, if we were to go in a time machine and ask Abraham Lincoln, are you gay or do you have an identity where you identify with having a specific type of sexual preference? He probably wouldn't understand what I was even saying, because it's a completely new idea that didn't come until after his time and really didn't become kind of popularized until the 20th century. So that's what I really like about my research and in the film itself, getting into those topics too.
How long did you work on this?
Well, I mean, if you want to go way back a very long time, because I read about this in a great book that's out of print now called The Intimate World of Abraham Lincoln that was written by Clarence Tripp, who was one of Alfred Kinsey's. I mean, Tripp wrote the book in his 80s and died before the book even came out, but he was one of Alfred Kinsey's sex researchers way back. And so Clarence Tripp, as a gay man and as a sex researcher, wanted to take all this historical evidence that really had only been studied by Lincoln scholars who were primarily white heterosexual men in institutions, and wanted to take this same evidence and look at it through a different lens and through different experiences. And it really ruffled a lot of feathers. And that was in 2005. So I had read that book in 2006, and I'd been trying to pitch some variation of this project for a very long time. And it wasn't until last year that we really kind of got it off the ground. And, through 2004 is when we primarily made the film. So we made it pretty quick.
Can you talk about additional research that you did and how you were able to line up all these great interviews with scholars and others?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like here's the thing, and if people don't know this, what's great is most professors at universities, their email is public. You go onto the university's website and their email will be there. And so I just cold emailed all of these people. And here's the thing, like they were really excited about the project because they want this topic out there and discussed. And I think a lot of people see in our kind of contemporary world that filmmaking is is the medium of the day. I mean, if you want to get something out there, especially to young people, it has to be in some sort of media form, because I think a lot of these professors realize, yes, this has been discussed in academic circles and in books, but it still didn't hit the mainstream. So they were very generous. And this is a lot of people's life's work. The other day I was on an NPR show debating with Michael Burlingame, who's one of the most well-known Lincoln scholars, and he's very against this theory. But I was saying, Dr. Burlingame, basically this film really isn't about Lincoln per se. This is about sexuality. And that's not your area of expertise. You keep pointing out to, well, here's a letter that showed that Lincoln flirted with this woman and, he liked this woman. And I said, we're not saying that he didn't have sex with women. He clearly got married to a woman. We're saying that doesn't eliminate him from having sex with men as well, which
Yeah.
was super common at the time. And if you look at it, like I have my little list here, but her like anybody, and keep in mind this is Queer History Month, LGBTQ History Month, and so if we want to go down the list of people that historians have said, yes, these men definitely have had queer relationships. Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, clearly had sex with men. Oscar Wilde famously had sex with men. Lord Byron, Ralph Emerson. But what all four of these men have in common? All four of these men were married, and all four of these men had children. It's like Oscar Wilde was married to a woman and had children. Yes, that's what happened back then. You got married, but you also were fluid and had sex with men, and it was very common. So we're not saying Lincoln was this outlier. It was very common practice at the time.
You mentioned earlier that this was a topic that some people have addressed, and there have been, I guess, whispers in the gay community for a while. But in terms of
Mhm.
mainstream really getting a notion of this, you're right. I mean, mainstream hasn't really talked about this. Why do you think that it was been? Is it just why do you think that this is just sort of new to the mainstream conversation?
Well, I mean, the short answer is that it's just like straight up homophobia. It's just like I think, one of our scholars in the film, John Stauffer from Harvard, he was the American Studies chairman of the Harvard at Harvard, and he's one of the greatest academic minds in America. He's in the film a lot, and he's a straight man. He's married, he has children, the whole thing. But he says you look at the evidence and it's so clear. But he has said literally famous Lincoln scholars, and he didn't name names, has said to him, if I lose my faith in Lincoln, I lose my faith in the nation. And what that person is saying is that if I lose my faith as Lincoln being this heterosexual, manly man, then I can't have faith in America. I can't think of him as a gay man because the nation falls apart for me. Because to these people, America is a heterosexual, heteronormative, gender specific, gender binary world. And this idea is breaking all of that apart. And it's amazing when queer people watch this film and when queer people look at the evidence, they're just like, yeah, it takes one to know one, perhaps. It's like, for example, in the film, one of Lincoln's first his first relationship that we have evidence of was with Billy Green. It's Lincoln's very young. He's in his early 20s. He leaves his father. He goes to live in New Salem, and he's working in a country store with this young kid named Billy Green. They're about the same age, and they like to read together, and they share a cot. Now, this is coming from Billy Green's own mouth. He says, we shared a cot for 18 months. That's a long time to share a cot. When you're working in a store that probably sells beds, you certainly have lots of lumber around. There's bearskin rugs around. You don't have to share a cot, right? You don't have to. Maybe in the winter for body warmth, but certainly not in the summer unless you really like it, right? And so, but then on top of that, Billy Green went on to say that Lincoln had the most perfect thighs that a human being could have. I mean, that's from his own mouth. And a normal heteronormative scholar might be like, oh, that's kind of weird. Maybe he had muscular thighs. I'm moving on. But to a sex researcher, like, wait a second, there's something here because you go back to Kinsey's work. One
Right.
of Kinsey's main questions was about femoral eroticism, sex with the femurs. Literally, we have it in the film. Literally, in one of his old questionnaires, have you ever put your private part between a man's thighs to simulate sex? And keep in mind, when Kinsey was doing these interviews in the 1930s, he was interviewing men that were having sex in the 1800s, like older men. So he's seeing this sexual technique, femoeroticism, and that's definitely a cue to what's going on there. And this just goes back to the suppression of queer history.
Yeah.
A straight white guy may not pick that up. You got to really look at the context of history. And that's what's so exciting about history. And we're hoping that this might spark the imagination of some younger people that are going to go into their studies and re-examine the primary sources, re-examine, the letters, all these letters, and look deeper into what's being said here.
Can you talk a little bit about Joshua Speed and his importance in Lincoln's life?
Joshua Speed, and here's what's great is that all scholars, regardless of where you are with Lincoln sexuality, will say that Joshua Speed was his most intimate friend of
Yeah.
all time.
Mhm.
And intimacy is where the debate happens. It's people will say in the Victorian period and in these times, men were closer, they're more affectionate. They point to, like, if you go to Italy to this day, men will hug and kiss each other on the lips. There's a different type of expression. And certainly where I grew up in Missouri, two men kissing, when they greet each other it means something very different. And so they'll argue that, but you also have to look at the way men were physically. There was a homosocial world, they called it. Men hung out with men and women hung out with women until you got married. And within this world where men are only hanging out with men, to say that they didn't like be sexual with each other is ridiculous. Especially with this argument that back then, and a lot of conservative historians will say, well, men shared beds, right? Like there weren't a lot of beds. You're out on the prairie, you share a bed. And that's true for financial reasons a lot of the times. But getting back to Joshua Speed, this is a man that Lincoln shared a bed with for 4 years. Now, that wasn't that common. Okay. So here's a guy, Lincoln moves to Springfield. He's young. He's a new lawyer. Maybe he doesn't have much money. Okay. We'll buy that. Right. So we do have a letter, though, that we from his mentor, William Butler. And this letter says, hey, my wife's mending your clothes. I just paid off some of your debts. You're moving to Springfield, moving with me. Like I'm your mentor. Like, we've known each other for a long time. And Lincoln decides not to move in with his mentor and instead moves in with a complete stranger he meets at his store that Joshua Speed owns. And if you see a picture of Joshua Speed, I mean, he is a beautiful, by today's standards, definitely a twink, right? Beautiful, beautiful young man. And Lincoln decides instead to move in with Joshua Speed, who says, hey, on the first day he meets him, I know you probably can't afford a bed, so why don't you just stay with me in my bed? And Lincoln moves in and he's with him for 4 years. And in that time, he's a legislator. He's a lawyer. He definitely could have afforded his own bed in his own place, but he stays with him. And the way we know that there's something more here is when Speed gets married. And his father dies, and he has to move back to the plantation and take over. And when he leaves Springfield, and Lincoln goes in this deep depression, and there's some letters exchanged. And in these letters, they are heartbreaking letters. And a love letter when you read one, especially from a politician and a lawyer. I mean, have you ever gotten a letter from a lawyer? I mean, they're dry. There's not a lot there. Most of Lincoln's writings, if you look at all of his letters throughout time, there's some jokes in there, but and there might be a little bit of a friendly line, but certainly not the way he wrote Speed. Heartbreaking letters talking about how jealous he is of Speed's new wife, talking about how he wants to die, talking about how that he is distraught for 10 hours. Anticipating the letter that he's going to get from Speed describing his wedding night. I mean, this is a man that does not put his emotion on the page, and with Speed he does, and so it's pretty clear that they were very involved.
You mentioned that during this time, it was common for men to have physicality, intimacy with other men. But was this something that, I mean, what I mean, would the climate, I mean, would the climate allow that? Like what would public perception have been of that, even though it was happening pretty frequently?
Well, that's a good question because, like some of these scholars will say, when Lincoln was in the White House, he made Joshua Speed's brother, James Speed, one of his cabinet members. And in front of everyone, he said, well, this is James Speed, everyone. And I know James well, but not as well as his brother, who I slept in the same bed with for 4 years. And he openly said this in front of everyone.
Mhm.
Now, in today's world, if a president had said that, the press would be like, what? And would run with it. The press didn't do a thing because that wasn't a big deal there. There was no scandal
Yeah.
because it was a common thing. So you have to really think about how different the 19th century is and take our own perception, our own 21st century thought, or even our own 20th century viewpoint and recontextualize it because nobody thought anything of it. Lots of people lived together back then. There was what's called a Boston marriage, where two women that never got married would live together their whole lives, and nobody really thought anything of it. People just thought of them as kind of like a little bit of like they were like my wife, and she was like my wife. It was a similar kind of context. the preferred thing was to get married and have children. And you needed children for a lot of reasons, to do work around the house, to help on the farm. It was a marriage culture, and you created these institutions. But it's not like today where, this person has a lot in common with me, I think I'll marry them. Nobody had anything common back then, other than we're building a house and a home and having children, and who you socialize and probably had sex with on the side was different than your chosen mate. So it was really common. And, if you look at the film, which I really, really loved, is all the photographs we have of this male intimacy. It's like we just have tons of photos of,
Exactly.
men holding hands, just affectionate. Like this doesn't seem like two pals to me.
Yeah.
Also, just kind of like the gender nonconforming people. This photo was taken in 1885. And then the cowboys, you think about a cowboy and his partner. They used to have these all male cowboy dances that were very, very intimate. And it was totally common. And keep in mind, there wasn't some sort of like gay underground photo studio. This
Yeah.
was a public photo studio where people would go in, and it wasn't like they're taking these pictures privately in their own rooms. You just go in and they're hugging and kissing each other and taking photos in the town, and nobody thought anything of it. There's hundreds of these photos out there.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that, you know, ultimately, this documentary is not necessarily all about Lincoln, but about the society. I mean, as you mentioned, a photo like that now would be a sensation. It would be all over the tabloids. Everybody would be speculating.
Yeah.
Back then, it was fairly common. Can you sort of just talk a little bit more about the differences in society and the
Yeah.
way we would look at that now?
Yeah, right. So basically, now we really have these binaries, right? You pick a side. You're gay or you're straight, or maybe you're bi, gay, straight, or maybe you're bi. And you pick a team,
Yeah.
and we know even in the gay male community, particularly, it's like, well, there's no such thing as a bi, you're just gay, and a lot of bi people feel prejudiced against them, and so that's the world we live in. And in that society, you didn't really think about that kind of stuff. You thought about sexual impulses. You're out on the prairie, two cowboys, for example, right? In the 1800s, two cowboys. You're going to be out watching your herd for months. You're
Yeah.
not going to see anybody for months, and you're not making a lot of money. So even if you do get into a town and you can have access to a prostitute, you may not have the dough for it, right? And you're certainly not going to get a quick date. And there's no social media apps, or there's no dating apps. So you have what's in front of you. You have another human being to hold and caress. And we see examples of this in our modern world too, whether it's Navy ships or in prison. When you have a large male population, there's a lot of consensual sex going on in prisons right now. And when they leave prison, they might go back to their girlfriend or their wife. That might be their preferred thing. But to exclude the idea that every human being on the planet doesn't have the capacity to have a fluid sexual encounter or intimate encounter is absurd, And I think what's really showing that is Generation Z. Gen Z has a whole host of new names and new categories and fluidity that they're saying none of this makes sense. Like, I can be who I want, when I want, how I want. And they are hearkening all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans. What amazes me is that everyone's like, oh yeah, the Greeks and the Romans, we're fine with that. But that type of behavior really didn't change until the 1900s, when Freud and when the doctors all of a sudden took it and it became a pathology. Like the normal became heterosexuality, which it wasn't throughout most of human history, and
Yeah.
pathologized it. And the church really liked that. And all of a sudden it becomes a problem. And that's only been about 100 years that we've been dealing with that.
In the documentary, there were interviews with people who talk about their admiration for Lincoln and they hold him in such high esteem. And it's really sad that this notion could conceivably lower people's respect level for Lincoln. But can you sort of talk about? I mean, can you sort of talk about that notion? Now, some people who've always adored Lincoln and put him up here in terms of his accomplishments may somehow now think of him less because of this.
Well, I mean, look, that's at the end of the film. We have this and we say at the beginning of the film, and we kind of piggyback it on the end too. It's like, listen, everyone agrees that Lincoln's our best president. Poll after poll shows everyone on both sides of the aisle.
Mhm.
But if we told you he was queer, would that change what a great president he was, what a great man he was, what a great human being he was, and the vision he had for equality in our nation? Would that change a thing? No. So our kind of our underneath like subtext is that it shouldn't change the way you feel about your son or daughter or your sibling or your offspring. You shouldn't, if they're playing with their gender or their identity, it shouldn't change your love for them because they're the same great person that you've always known.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the question we're putting out there. Does it matter? Like all of these things are made up. I was speaking to a group recently, and it just comes down to this. These things are social constructions. These things, homosexual and heterosexual, are made up, completely made up words that happened in 1870. These two words came out of nowhere.
Mhm.
And then all of a sudden, everyone applied them to everyone. So if they can make stuff up, if the church can make stuff up, we can make stuff up too. We can reject this made up stuff because it's all made up. The only things that are constants, I think, in the world are love, pleasure, affection, and impulses. And if your impulse is to two men to hold each other in their arms,
Mhm.
there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very human thing.
So you had a theatrical release. Congratulations! And
Thank you.
now the film is. Can you sort of talk about where people can see the documentary now?
Yeah, we're really fortunate. We've actually teamed up with the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, and they do a tremendous amount of good work in the LGBTQ community, and especially this month being LGBTQ History Month, we've teamed up with them. So a portion of all of our proceeds go to HRC, and
Mhm.
so now you can rent the film or buy the film on all the major platforms. So whether you use Amazon Prime or Apple TV or Fandango or YouTube, you can rent it at home, and we really hope some people look at it because it's not. I wouldn't say it's totally like a true crime show, but it is one of the. It is the structure of the film is here's evidence. We're
Yeah.
presenting the evidence to people, and we're doing it in a timeline along Lincoln's life. We're presenting evidence about the context of the world that he lived in,
Yeah.
and we're asking the audience to take this in, and we'd love to hear what you think. Does it pass the test? I feel like it does. I would not have made this film if I don't think the evidence was there. And it's taking a new generation, I think, of scholars and individuals to look at this stuff with a new eye.
Gotcha. Okay. Lover
Yeah.
Lover of Man: The Untold History of Abraham Lincoln is now available to stream and rent. It's an extraordinary documentary directed by Shaun Peterson. Thank you so much for talking to me today, Shaun.
Jim, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Nice
And
to
I
meet
and I went to preschool in Marietta, so
you. You
I
did?
love my Georgia. Yes, I did. So
How long
I
ago
love
was
my
that?
Georgia.
How long ago was that?
1979. I mean, Marietta was not the Marietta of today, certainly. Neither was Atlanta. So yeah, but I still have a fondness for my youth in Georgia in the pines down there.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much. It's
Yeah.
great talking to you.
Okay. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks.